The temp badge clipped to her scrubs was crooked. Rachel Torres noticed it in the bathroom mirror before she even clocked in, the plastic rectangle catching the fluorescent light at an angle that screamed temporary, disposable, here to fill a gap. She straightened it 3 times. It kept tilting back the same way, as if the universe was determined to announce her invisibility before she even stepped onto the floor. Sacred Heart Hospital in Portland smelled like antiseptic layered over something older, fear, maybe, or the accumulated breath of people who'd learned their mortality in these corridors. Rachel had walked into worse. She'd walked through Tikrit. She'd walked through the kind of darkness that made fluorescent-lit hallways feel like mercy. But that was the problem. Nobody here knew that. Nobody here knew anything about her except what the staffing agency had told them, a fill-in nurse, 2 weeks maybe, don't get attached, probably won't last the month. The tremor started in her hands before the shift even began. A door slammed somewhere down the east corridor. Just a supply closet. Just someone in a hurry. But Rachel's whole body reacted, shoulders tensing, jaw clenching, hands shaking so badly she had to grip the sink counter until her knuckles went white. She closed her eyes. Counted backward from 10. A breathing technique from the VA clinic she'd never actually attended, learned instead from a YouTube video at 3 a.m. while her daughter slept upstairs, back when Rachel still lived like she was supposed to exist. 15 seconds. That's all it took for the shaking to stop. 15 seconds of muscle memory that had nothing to do with nursing and everything to do with survival. She unlocked her locker in the break room, the only locker with an actual key lock instead of a combination dial. The staffing agency had called ahead, requested it specifically, asked her not to share the combination with anyone. Rachel had thought that was odd until she remembered that she'd specifically requested to keep something locked away. Nobody at Sacred Heart knew that. Nobody knew she carried a piece of her past into every shift, hidden in the lining of her jacket like contraband. The faded unit patch was the size of a playing card, embroidered in navy blue and gold that had dulled to the color of old bruises. The stitching around the edges had started to fray from being touched too many times, not worn, just handled, the way someone might touch a scar they were trying to understand. Rachel's fingers traced the outline through the fabric. The patch itself said nothing. No names. No dates. No indication of what it had meant or what she'd had to become to earn it. That was the point. She tucked the jacket into the back corner of the locker, beneath her spare scrubs and the bag lunch her 16-year-old daughter had packed without knowing where her mother actually was. 2 chicken sandwiches wrapped in foil, a bag of carrot sticks, an apple. Normal things. The kind of lunch a mother who worked normal hours at a normal job would have packed. Rachel closed the locker and turned the key until it clicked. The east wing of Sacred Heart during shift change was controlled chaos, nurses moving between stations with the efficiency of people who'd learned to anticipate disaster, doctors walking with the kind of confidence that came from having authority written into their paychecks. Rachel observed them the way a small predator observes larger ones. Not with fear. With assessment. She was learning the hierarchy, the invisible lines of who deferred to whom, the exact distance to maintain between herself and competence so no one expected anything from her beyond the bare minimum. She moved to the assignment board. 3 medical surgical patients, 1 post-op recovery, 1 admission intake if the ER sent up a bed. Standard. Manageable. She could do this work in her sleep, could probably do the entire floor's worth of work in her sleep, but the trick was not to let anyone notice. The trick was to be the kind of person who didn't have opinions, didn't volunteer, didn't make suggestions that might sound like she knew better. The trick was to be so thoroughly unremarkable that no one paid attention when she did things with precision that suggested muscle memory instead of textbooks. A portable ultrasound machine needed restocking on the 2nd floor. Rachel gathered supplies with methodical care, checking off items on the inventory sheet with handwriting so small and neat it looked like it belonged to someone apologizing for existing. The equipment room smelled like plastic packaging and ozone. Her hands moved with the kind of automatic competence that came from muscle memory, from the kind of training you never really forgot, the kind that lived in your bone marrow and your grip strength and the way your fingers knew exactly where things went without your brain having to think about it. The surgical resident from the East Wing, Dr. Chen, young enough to still have enthusiasm, glanced up from her own inventory tasks. "Hey. Rachel, right? You're temp." Rachel nodded. "Didn't elaborate. I watched you assist with the laceration repair yesterday," Dr. Chen said. Paused. The kind of pause that suggested she was choosing words carefully. "Your suture technique is really clean." "Thank you, Doctor." Rachel said it the way someone said it when they were acknowledging a compliment they'd never asked for, the way someone said it when they wanted the conversation to end. Dr. Chen seemed to take the hint. She went back to her restocking. Rachel finished her own task in silence and disappeared back into the hallway before anyone else could notice she was there. But someone had noticed. Dr. Hargrove was standing near the nurse's station when Rachel returned the ultrasound supplies, his coffee cup held like a scepter, his white coat unbuttoned in a way that suggested confidence or indifference. Rachel had learned the difference between the two, and Hargrove was definitely the second. He wasn't tall, exactly, but he took up space like someone who believed his presence changed the molecular composition of rooms. His eyes followed Rachel across the station with the focused attention of a predator tracking movement through tall grass. She felt the weight of that attention the way she felt the tremor in her hands when doors slammed. Not as an observation. As a warning. "Torres," he said. Not a question. An announcement. "The temp." "Yes, Doctor." Rachel kept her hand steady. Kept her voice at that careful pitch that suggested deference without actual fear. "The mask." She'd been practicing it all week. "How's that working out for you?" He took a sip of coffee while he watched her, and there was something in the way he held his eyes that suggested he already knew the answer he was looking for. "The temp thing. You settling in?" "It's an adjustment," Rachel said. "Neutral. Safe. The kind of answer that committed to nothing." "I bet it is." He smiled. It wasn't a warm expression. "New places. New people. Takes a while to figure out where you fit." Rachel nodded. Said nothing. That was the skill nobody taught you in nursing school, the art of being present in a conversation without actually being there. She'd learned it in other places, in rooms where saying too much had consequences. Hargrove's smile widened slightly, like he'd expected exactly this response and found it amusing. "Well, welcome to Sacred Heart. I'm sure you'll find your level soon enough." He walked past her without waiting for a response, and Rachel felt the tension in her shoulders release like a held breath. She didn't watch him go. She went back to her patients, to the work that required nothing but focus and precision, to the invisible space between competence and anonymity where she decided to live. The shift moved like all shifts did, in increments of crisis management and small kindnesses, in vital signs and medication schedules, in the constant low-level triage that separated patients who could wait another hour from patients who couldn't. Rachel moved through it like water through a channel, present but not intrusive, there but not remarkable. At 2:45 p.m., someone's line infiltrated and she replaced it with a needle stick so clean the patient barely flinched. At 4:20 p.m., she caught an early sign of fever in the post-op patient that the monitor should have flagged but didn't, and she reported it in such a matter-of-fact way that the resident on call almost thanked her before catching himself and just acknowledging the information. What the resident didn't know was that Rachel's hands didn't shake when she inserted fours anymore. The shaking happened after. It happened in the locked locker room. It happened when she touched the patch. At 6:15 p.m., during the second shift change, Rachel was moving supplies between rooms when she heard Hargrove's voice carrying down the corridor. Not toward her. Just in the hospital's ecosystem, the way his voice seemed to inhabit space regardless of where he was standing. The temp nurse from staffing, he was saying to someone. The one with the wrinkled badge. "I want to keep an eye on that one." But that wasn't the worst part. What happened next would prove that Dr. Hargrove had already decided exactly what he was going to do with Rachel Torres, exactly how he was going to test the invisible limits of her patience, and exactly what he expected to find when he pushed. The problem was that Hargrove was looking for weakness in all the wrong places. He was watching for trembling hands or averted eyes or the kind of hesitation that came from uncertainty. What he should have been watching for was the opposite. What he should have been afraid of was precision. Rachel finished her shift at 7 p.m., clocked out, and walked to her locker one final time. She withdrew her jacket. She felt the weight of the patch in its hidden place, sewn into the lining with stitches that had been made by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. She put on the jacket, buttoned it, locked the locker. The Portland evening was cold, the kind of cold that came from the rain that was probably hours away but already existed in the air like a promise. Rachel walked to her car, and for just a moment, standing in the parking lot with the jacket zipped and the patch against her ribs, she let the mask drop. Her shoulders straightened. Her jaw unclenched. Her hand steadied. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, who'd learned how to become invisible in order to survive, had just walked into Sacred Heart Hospital for the first time, and she had no idea that the hospital had already begun its own countdown toward the moment when invisibility was no longer an option. The Thursday morning staff meeting began like every other morning at Sacred Heart, fluorescent lights humming their electric drone, coffee growing cold in styrofoam cups, 23 people arranged in folding chairs arranged in a loose semicircle around the conference table. Rachel sat in the back row, temporary badge clipped to her scrubs like a scarlet letter, taking notes on the pediatric census update that nobody would remember by lunch. Dr. Hargrove leaned back in his chair at the front, the kind of man whose voice had been getting louder his entire life because nobody had ever asked him to lower it. His tailored white coat hung perfectly on shoulders that had never carried anything heavier than a golf club. He glanced at his Rolex, a $12,000 gesture of contempt, and grinned. "I'm taking bets," he announced to the room. $50 says the temp in pediatrics doesn't last the week. Anyone? No takers? Guess you all agree. The laughter started nervously. A few nurses glanced at Rachel. Most didn't. In a room where hierarchy was measured in credentials and seniority, a temporary nurse was barely solid enough to cast a shadow. Rachel kept her pen moving across her notepad. Item 7, Discharge Planning Protocols. Item 8, Hand Hygiene Reminders. Her jaw tightened exactly once. That was all. Dr. Hargrove watched her, disappointed that his cruelty hadn't landed harder, that she hadn't flushed or trembled or excused herself to the bathroom to cry. He'd been doing this for 17 years, isolating the vulnerable ones, the ones who carried their desperation like a visible wound. They usually broke by Thursday. Rachel Torres didn't even look up from her notes. The meeting concluded at 8:38 a.m. Rachel stood, folded her notes with precise movements, and walked out of the conference room without acknowledging anyone. The hallway smelled like industrial antiseptic and fresh coffee and something underneath that no amount of bleach could remove, the particular scent of human suffering, present in every hospital, invisible to everyone except the people who worked there long enough to stop noticing it. She spent her morning in the pediatrics ward where sick children didn't care whether their nurse wore a permanent badge or a temporary one. A 5-year-old with pneumonia held her hand during a breathing treatment. An 8-year-old asked her to braid her hair. Rachel's movements were gentle, economical, the hands of someone who had learned long ago that precision was kindness. Nobody watching her would have guessed that she'd spent 18 months in Tikrit teaching Navy corpsmen how to stop arterial bleeding in the field. The cafeteria at 11:32 a.m. was crowded with the lunch shift, nurses coming in, doctors heading out, dietary staff prepping for afternoon rounds. Rachel carried her tray, turkey sandwich, apple, black coffee, toward an empty table near the corner window. The rain hammered Portland in sheets, the kind of downpour that made you think the sky was drowning itself. She didn't see Dr. Hargrove until his foot extended into her path. The tray went down like a building imploding. Turkey sandwich scattered across white tile. Soup splashed in an expanding arc. The apple rolled 6 feet before stopping against a table leg. The styrofoam cup tumbled, black coffee spreading in an irregular stain that looked like continents. The room didn't go silent, it became suddenly aware of itself, 20 pairs of eyes pretending not to watch. Rachel knelt immediately, her movements controlled, her breathing even. She reached for the largest pieces of ceramic. Her colleagues looked away. They recognized this for what it was, a demonstration of territory, a public confirmation of rank. Nobody intervened because intervening meant becoming the next target. Dr. Hargrove leaned down, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive that probably cost more than her shift's pay. His voice was soft, which made it worse. "Clumsy today, sweetheart." Rachel continued gathering debris. A piece of sandwich. Half the apple. Her hands were absolutely steady. Her breathing hadn't changed. Dr. Hargrove straightened, pulled a patient chart from his coat pocket, and dropped it at her feet with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never been taught that actions had weight. Room for 12 needs vitals. Try not to break anything. He paused, let the silence build. "Sweetheart." Rachel stayed kneeling for 3 more seconds. She gathered the last piece of the plate. She stood with the patient chart in one hand, the broken ceramic in the other, and she looked directly at him. Her eyes were the color of wet slate, not angry, not sad, but something worse. Empty. Like looking into windows of a house nobody lived in anymore. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible, barely present. "I've cleaned up worse messes than this, doctor." A single tear escaped down her right cheek. Rachel wiped it away without breaking eye contact, without flinching, without dropping his gaze for half a heartbeat. She didn't retreat. Didn't apologize. Didn't do any of the things he was waiting for. She simply turned and walked toward the sink to dispose of the broken ceramic, leaving Dr. Hargrove standing in the middle of the cafeteria holding nothing but his own silence. The lunch crowd returned to their meals. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody would mention it in the break room or the parking lot or at home that evening. But something had shifted in that moment, a small, barely visible fracture in the hierarchy. Dr. Hargrove felt it the same way a shark feels a drop of blood in an otherwise empty ocean. He would need to do better. Louder. More strategic. This temp nurse wasn't breaking the way they were supposed to break. Rachel completed her shift at 3:15 p.m. and drove home through rain that seemed personal, directed specifically at her windshield. Her apartment was a studio in a converted Victorian, high ceilings, original hardwood, the kind of place that felt temporary even when you'd been there 6 months. She parked in the alley, climbed the back stairs, and opened the door to find her daughter Emma at the kitchen table surrounded by AP chemistry notes and empty ramen bowls. Emma Torres was 16, brilliant in the way that only children of military parents could be brilliant, focused, disciplined, and completely unaware of what her mother had been doing for the last 18 years. Rachel had left the Navy without explanation, without telling Emma why their life in San Diego had suddenly evaporated into a cross-country move and a new name at a new hospital. Kids didn't ask questions if you moved fast enough, if you kept them busy enough, if you made sure their lives stayed stable even when you were falling apart at the cellular level. "How was work, Mom?" Rachel set down her bag, hung her jacket in the closet, and forced her face into something that resembled a smile. "Quiet. Just another day." Emma looked up from her chemistry problem set, her eyes identical to Rachel's, that wet slate color, but still filled with the kind of hope that hadn't learned to be careful yet. She was why Rachel had come to Portland. She was why Rachel couldn't afford to be the person she'd been in Tikrit. She was why invisibility felt like survival. "Want to help me with molecular bonding?" "I don't understand why the electrons." Rachel sat down beside her daughter and forced herself to focus on electrons and bonding structures and the complicated mathematics of why atoms wanted to connect. Outside, rain continued hammering the windows. Inside, the fluorescent light above the kitchen table buzzed with the same frequency as the one at Sacred Heart, and Rachel's mind was still there, still feeling Dr. Hargrove's presence like a stain that wouldn't wash out. At 2:06 a.m., Rachel's phone erupted into the darkness. She was awake before the second ring, something trained into her muscle memory by 18 years of emergency calls in the field. Her hand found the phone in the dark. The charge nurse's voice was panicked, barely controlled. "Rachel, you need to come back." The general, the post-op admission from yesterday, he crashed. "Cardiac tamponade. We're calling people in." Rachel was already out of bed, already pulling on clothes. ETA 15 minutes. She moved through her apartment like a ghost, like someone who'd learned how to get ready without making noise, without waking people, without leaving traces. She grabbed her jacket, the one with the faded unit patch sewn into the lining, the only piece of her past she'd kept, pressed against her ribs like a secret, and she was down the back stairs and into the rain before Emma's eyes even opened. The drive to Sacred Heart took 11 minutes at 2:17 a.m. through empty Portland streets. Traffic lights blinked red at nobody. The rain had become biblical, the kind of downpour that erased visibility, that made you feel like you were drowning on dry land. Rachel's hands on the steering wheel were absolutely steady. Her breathing was even. Whatever had been sitting in her chest for the last 18 months, the trauma, the weight, the carefully buried version of herself, was starting to wake up. She parked in the emergency lot and ran toward the ER entrance, and she had no idea that the Marine General's collapse was going to change everything, that in approximately 4 hours she would perform an emergency medical procedure that only Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres would have the training to execute, that Dr. Hargrove would finally understand exactly who he'd been mocking in the cafeteria, and that the countdown toward the end of her invisibility had just started its final descent. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she didn't know yet that she was going to lose everything trying to save him. 2 days after the cafeteria incident, Rachel stood across from the surgical resident in OR3, her hands already prepped, nails cut surgical short, surgical loops positioned on her forehead. The Marine General lay supine on the table beneath the overhead lights, already intubated for what should have been a routine appendectomy, 30 minutes, maybe 40. Straightforward. Clean. The kind of surgery that didn't demand anything more than standard competence. She'd arrived at 7:53 a.m., 12 minutes before the scheduled start time. Nobody noticed. The resident, Dr. Chen, barely glanced at her, more interested in his phone than in reviewing the chart one final time. The attending surgeon, Dr. Morrison, was already scrubbing, moving with the casual efficiency of someone who'd performed this procedure approximately 4,000 times in his career. Rachel had counted his hands, steady, unmarked, the hands of a man who made good money doing routine work well. The anesthesiologist checked the ventilator settings, 8 milliliters per kilogram, FiO2 at 40%, just enough oxygen to keep the general's blood gas where it needed to be. The monitors beeped their familiar rhythm. BP 118/76. Heart rate 68. Sinus rhythm. Everything in the green. Everything normal. Morrison made the incision with the confidence of a man holding a pen, not a scalpel. Right lower quadrant McBurney incision, muscle splitting approach, clean separation of the external oblique aponeurosis. The peritoneum opened with a soft hiss. Rachel anticipated the retractor before Morrison's hand moved toward it, her body already reaching for the Richardson, angling it with the precise depth that would give him maximum visibility without tearing tissue. Her movements had the quality of a violinist reaching for a note before hearing it played, predictive, muscle-driven, the kind of precision that came from having assisted in 247 emergency surgeries, not from nursing school. Dr. Chen watched her from across the table. He didn't say anything, but she felt his eyes tracking her hands. Appendix identification was textbook. Morrison worked it free from the mesentery, ligated the appendicular artery with 4.0 silk, divided it cleanly. The appendix came free intact, no perforation, no contamination. He'd been right, straightforward. Rachel had the specimen basin ready before he reached for it, the motion so fluid it seemed choreographed. The closure would take another 8 minutes. Interrupted 2.0 vicryl for the peritoneum, 0 vicryl for the muscle layer. But then Morrison turned toward her with the suture needles. Not 2.0. Not the standard closure gauge. 3.0 silk. His hands repositioned, asking without words for something different. Rachel understood immediately. The general's tissue had felt different under the retractors, slightly edematous, the kind of swelling that suggested infection somewhere else, not just the appendix. If the peritoneum got inflamed later, standard sutures might not hold. He wanted her to close the muscle layer. Not the attending. Not the resident. The temp nurse. Rachel took the needle. The OR fell into that particular silence that only happens in good surgical teams, no wasted movement, no unnecessary chatter, just the rhythm of breath and monitor and the soft click-click-click of instruments passing. Her hands moved into the suture pattern without conscious thought. She'd learned this not in a field hospital outside Tikrit, taught by a trauma surgeon named Captain Holloway, stitched into her muscle memory during operations that lasted 16 hours without stopping, operations where the knots had to hold because there was no sterile OR behind you, no backup team, no second chance if tissue came apart. The knot was specific. Double throw, then 3 single throws, each one locked with the kind of tension that came from knowing exactly how much force tissue could tolerate before tearing. It was beautiful, actually, economical, efficient, the kind of knot that looked simple but carried the weight of hard experience. Military medics developed their own variations, like handwriting. You could identify a Navy combat medic from their sutures the way a forensics expert could identify a killer. The knots had personality. The knots told stories. Rachel tied off the peritoneal layer. Then the muscle. Each closure came together with the quiet satisfaction of something constructed to last. Dr. Morrison was watching her now. He'd recognized the pattern immediately. You didn't work trauma for 23 years without learning what military field closure looked like. But he said nothing. Just repositioned slightly, angling to watch her hands rather than guide them. The skin closure was standard, staples, 14 of them, placed with even spacing of 5 millimeters. Rachel's hands moved steady and sure, the instrument mechanically clicking, each staple seating with a soft metallic sound that echoed through the OR. She didn't hurry. She didn't hesitate. She worked like someone who had closed wounds under fire, who had sutured by the glow of a headlamp while explosions echoed outside a concrete wall, who understood that the difference between a patient walking out of this hospital and a patient returning with sepsis came down to whether you took those extra 2 seconds to get the closure right. It was 8:34 a.m. Surgery complete. 16 minutes total. Rachel was already removing her gloves. That's when the general's eyes opened. His consciousness surfaced like a submarine breaking through water, not sudden, not complete, just his eyelids separating by an inch, then 2 inches, his pupils finding focal points through the anesthetic haze that hadn't fully released him yet. His eyes were gray. Military eyes. The kind that had watched things. He should have been unconscious still, should have remained under until the anesthesiologist brought him up on a careful titratable schedule in recovery. But consciousness sometimes arrived unscheduled, especially in younger patients, especially in patients whose bodies had been trained to process trauma differently. The general's gray eyes found Rachel's face across the operating table. And then they found her hands. She knew immediately what he was seeing. Not just her technique, any competent surgical nurse could move smoothly, could anticipate instruments, could demonstrate hospital training. But the closure pattern itself. The specific construction of those knots. The spacing. The tension. The quality of work that came from having practiced that exact knot under conditions where perfection wasn't optional, it was survival. His eyes tracked her hands to her face. Gray to gray. Recognition flickering across his features like a switch being thrown. "You served," he whispered. Not a question. A statement. His words came slurred through the endotracheal tube, his voice carrying the particular rasp of someone whose vocal cords had been tugged aside by plastic, but the voice beneath that rasp was steady. Cognizant. Certain. Combat medic. He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've seen those knots before." The OR went perfectly still. Dr. Morrison's hand froze. Dr. Chen's breathing audibly caught. The anesthesiologist's fingers stilled above the medication pump. Rachel's heartbeat didn't accelerate. Her breathing didn't quicken. Her hands didn't shake. But something deeper shifted inside her chest, a tectonic plate moving, a fault line realigning, the exact sensation of being seen. She didn't answer. She simply continued her work, closing the final incision site with the same precision, the same steady hands. Her face remained neutral, her jaw locked at an angle that suggested nothing but professional focus. She'd learned long ago how to metabolize shock, how to compress emotion into a place small enough to carry while maintaining external stillness. Her voice, when it finally came out, was neutral. Perfunctory. The voice of a competent temp nurse, nothing more. Vitals stable, doctor. But the general's eye stayed on her for another 5 seconds before the anesthetic finally claimed him completely and his eyelids drifted closed again. His last conscious act was recognition. The last thing his brain processed before darkness was the understanding that this woman, this temp nurse in scrubs, this invisible hospital worker, had training that didn't come from a civilian nursing program. Rachel removed her gloves. Removed her loops. Positioned herself to assist with the transport to recovery. Every movement deliberate. Every movement controlled. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. Her voice remained level as she addressed the attending, post-op notes ready for transport. Doctor. No complications. Perfect closure. Perfect closure. The words carried more weight than they should have. Dr. Morrison studied her for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes moving from her face to her hands and back again. He was calculating something. Estimating. Running surgical expertise against the evidence in front of him. What he saw didn't match what he'd expected to see. A temporary nursing assignment at a small Portland hospital shouldn't come with this level of competence. This level of speed. This level of knowing. Good work, Torres, Morrison said finally. Not warmly. Just acknowledging fact. He turned away, already moving on to the next task, the next patient, the next routine surgery. Rachel transported the general to recovery at 8:42 a.m. She didn't look at his face again. She didn't look at his chart. She transferred him to the recovery bay with the same efficiency she'd demonstrated in the OR, checked his monitors one final time, confirmed his vitals with the recovery nurse, and stepped back. Her shift was over at 9 a.m. 47 minutes left. She found the changing room, peeled off her surgical scrubs, and pulled on her regular nursing scrubs. The faded unit patch sewn inside the jacket lining brushed against her ribs as she shrugged into the fabric. She didn't touch it. She never touched it. The patch was the only piece of her past she'd kept, old enough that the stitching had started to fray, the insignia barely visible after years of being pressed against her skin and laundered in hospital-grade detergent. 18 years she'd carried it. 18 years of weight she'd learned to ignore. The locker door closed. Rachel clipped her badge to her pocket and walked toward the parking lot, already thinking about what she'd make for dinner, already pushing the general's grey eyes and his whispered recognition into that small place where she kept all the dangerous things. The sun was bright outside. Portland's April weather had turned temperate and clear. She made it to her car before her phone buzzed with a text from the staffing agency, call HR before end of shift. Something's come up. She stared at the text for 6 seconds. Then she got in her car and drove home, already knowing that something had broken open inside that OR, something she'd spent months carefully keeping sealed. The general had seen her. The recognition in his eyes had been absolute, professional, the kind of certainty that only came from having worked alongside combat medics, from having watched military sutures being placed during field operations she didn't need to detail and wouldn't discuss. By 2 p.m., after Rachel had showered and changed into civilian clothes and tried to believe that the general's words meant nothing, her phone rang. The hospital administrator's voice was apologetic but formal. Ms. Torres, we need to schedule an immediate review of your credential verification. There are questions about your scope of practice during this morning's procedure. The monitor alarm screamed at 2:17 a.m. Rachel was 3 floors up, sitting in the break room with cold coffee and a stack of discharge papers, when the code came through the hospital intercom. Trauma alert, ICU 4. Crash team to ICU 4 now. She didn't move. Not her patient. Not her responsibility anymore. The temp badge clipped to her scrubs felt heavier than it should have. But the voice that came next made her freeze. That's the general. Post-op cardiac patient. We need all hands. Her hands were already moving before her brain caught up. Muscle memory didn't ask permission. She was on her feet, scrubs still damp from the shift, her fingers instinctively checking for the ultrasound wand. She'd memorized where they kept them on this floor weeks ago. Running. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. ICU 4 was chaos wrapped in fluorescent light. Dr. Hargrove hadn't arrived yet. The on-call resident, a young man whose name she'd heard once and forgotten, stood frozen beside the bed, an ultrasound probe trembling in his hand. His eyes were locked on the monitor. The general's pressure had collapsed, 68/42 and dropping like a stone. Oxygen sat at 87. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, fighting against fluid that shouldn't be there. Cardiac tamponade, Rachel said. Not a question. She could read the vitals like a language she'd spoken in another lifetime. Muffled heart sounds. Hypertension. The kind of pressure that meant the heart was drowning inside its own sac. The resident blinked at her. We're waiting for. He's got 4 minutes before arrest. Rachel's voice didn't rise. It just dropped an octave, and somehow that was more authoritative than any shout. She was already scanning the crash cart. 18-gauge needle. Syringe. Prep the chest. You can't, the protocol. The resident's hands were shaking now, the ultrasound wand wavering uselessly. Rachel didn't argue. She didn't ask permission. She picked up the needle herself, her hand steady as surgical steel, and felt the weight of it like coming home. The second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She'd done this in a forward operating base with mortars landing 3 blocks away. She could do this in a Portland ICU in the middle of the night. She marked the spot with her gloved finger. Cleaned it with antiseptic that smelled like a dozen hospitals and 2 wars. The general's eyes were half open, unseeing, his skin the color of old concrete. The pressure monitor showed 62/38. Time was gone. The needle went in. Her hands didn't shake. They moved with the terrible precision of someone who'd learned this skill when lives depended on it, because they had. Because she'd lost count of how many lives depended on it. The needle pushed through skin, through muscle, through the pericardial sac itself. And then, the hiss of air escaping. Fluid dark as old wine spilling into the syringe. Pressure releasing. The monitor beeped. Once. Twice. The waveform climbed. 75, the nurse called out. 82, 88. Pressure stabilizing. Rachel didn't move. She kept the needle steady, kept drawing off fluid until the pressure equalized and the heart could beat again. The general's oxygen saturation crept back toward normal. The monitor found its rhythm. Sinus rhythm. She'd brought him back from the edge with nothing but her hands and something that lived in her muscles like a ghost that wouldn't die. Dr. Hargrove arrived 4 minutes after Rachel stepped back from the bed. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene, the fluid in the syringe, the needle still in position, Rachel standing with her hand still raised like she'd just committed a crime. His eyes moved to the monitor. Stable. To the general. Breathing. To Rachel's face, absolutely composed, showing nothing. She saw the moment he understood what had happened. More importantly, she saw the moment he decided what to do about it. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted, like a predator recognizing prey. His power came from knowing the rules and how to weaponize them. This wasn't chaos. This was opportunity. Get someone to document this, he said quietly to the resident. Then, to Rachel, step away from the patient, please. She stepped away. She'd learned long ago that sometimes you move when they tell you to move. Sometimes survival is just compliance until you're somewhere safe. She watched him approach the bed, already reaching for the file, already reading the monitor numbers like he'd been here the whole time. Like he understood what had just happened and exactly how to frame it. By 6 a.m., before the morning shift even started, Dr. Hargrove had already made 3 phone calls. The first was to the chief nursing officer. Scope of practice concerns during an emergency response. Possible medication administration without proper oversight. He didn't mention that Rachel hadn't given any medication. He mentioned what she'd done, and then he mentioned what the rule book said she couldn't do. The second was to the staffing agency that had placed Rachel. I'm documenting a pattern of concerning behaviors. Overstepping her licensure. We may need to terminate the contract for safety reasons. The word safety was always the key. Safety unlocked doors that nothing else could. The third was to the hospital's legal counsel. I want an outside investigator. No appearance of bias. We need to protect the institution here. Institutional protection. The phrase that made everything else disappear, a patient outcomes, human decency, the fact that the general was alive because a woman with military training had refused to let him die. By 8 a.m., Rachel was sitting across from the chief nursing officer and a hospital attorney in a small conference room with no windows. Dr. Hargrove stood by the window anyway, his arms crossed, his presence like a scar that wouldn't heal. The attorney was a woman in a charcoal suit with a rehearsed expression. She read from a prepared statement as if she'd written it the night before. Which she probably had. Performing invasive procedures outside your licensure scope. Failure to wait for appropriate physician coverage. Violation of hospital protocol sections for point 2 and 7.8. Rachel tried. God, she tried. The patient would have died. His pressure was 62/38. Cardiac tamponade doesn't wait for. The patient would have received appropriate care from qualified personnel, Hargrove said, his voice smooth as oil. Instead, you decided you knew better than our protocols. That's the issue here, isn't it? Your judgment. Your willingness to override the system. The chief nursing officer wouldn't meet her eyes. Rachel recognized that look, the look of someone who'd already decided, someone for whom the meeting was just theater. The attorney slid a document across the table. Your contract with the staffing agency is terminated effective immediately. The hospital will not be filing criminal charges given the outcome, but your credentials are flagged with the state board pending their review. Flagged. That one word meant everything. It meant months of waiting. It meant never working in Portland again. It meant starting over somewhere else, if anywhere else would even have her after flagged showed up on her record. Rachel picked up the document. She read it. She didn't sign it, they didn't ask her to, and she left it on the table when she stood up. At noon, security escorted her to her locker. A young man, maybe 23, who wouldn't quite look at her. She retrieved the few things she'd brought, a sweater, a water bottle, her jacket. She found the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, her fingers tracing its outline one last time. The weight of it felt unbearable, like carrying proof of a person she wasn't allowed to be anymore. Her badge was deactivated at the front desk. The nurse there, someone Rachel had helped through a difficult night shift 2 days ago, watched in silence as she turned it over. Staff members drifted past, careful not to make eye contact. In hospitals, the terminated moved through corridors like ghosts. You learned not to see them. You learned that complicity was safer than solidarity. She carried a small cardboard box through the lobby. Someone had put her name on it. Rachel Torres. As if she needed confirmation of her own identity. At 2 p.m., she sat at her kitchen table still in her scrubs, her hands folded, staring at nothing. The box beside her might as well have been a coffin. 5 years of trying to disappear into the walls, 5 years of keeping her head down, 5 years of being nobody so she could be safe. And one moment, one decision to let her hands do what they'd been trained to do, had destroyed it all. Her daughter came home early from school at 3 p.m. 16 years old, home from soccer practice, expecting her mother to be at work. She froze in the doorway, her eyes reading Rachel's face like a language she understood too well. The look of a parent who'd broken something they couldn't fix. Mom? Why are you home early? Rachel couldn't speak. The words were somewhere deeper than her throat could reach. Her daughter dropped her backpack and sat beside her. Mom, what happened? Rachel touched the patch in her jacket, the only piece of her past she'd kept, and felt it weigh 1,000 pounds. I tried to save someone. And I lost everything. Her daughter put her arms around her, confused, scared, not understanding any of it. Neither did Rachel, really. She only knew that somewhere in the hospital, Dr. Hargrove was already writing his incident report, already protecting himself, already moving forward. And she was sitting at a kitchen table in scrubs that smelled like another woman's emergency, another woman's life saved, another woman entirely. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what would happen 5 hours later. The worst part was already in motion, already rolling toward the hospital like a storm that would change everything. The chief nursing officer sat across from Rachel with a file folder unopened between them. 8 in the morning. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in glass. The hospital attorney stood by her chair, reading from a prepared statement in a voice designed to shield liability, not deliver truth. Protocol violations. Scope of practice exceeded. Unauthorized procedure. The words landed like stones, each one carefully chosen to transform heroism into a fireable offense. Dr. Hargrove stood by the window with his arms crossed, his reflection in the glass showing no expression. He had made 3 calls the night before. 1 to the board chairman's assistant. 1 to the staffing agency director he'd met at a conference in Denver. 1 to a compliance investigator who owed him a favor from a case 7 years ago. The sabotage was no longer crude mockery. It was institutional. It was official. It wore the uniform of policy and procedure. Rachel's composure was a vault. Jaw set. Breathing steady. Hands resting flat on the table. She listened to the attorney explain how her intervention, though medically sound, constituted a violation of her scope of practice as a temporary nursing staff member. The words were designed to make her feel small. They had no effect. The chief nursing officer would not meet her eyes. She had called Rachel a hero in the break room yesterday. Now she read from talking points, her voice the careful neutral tone of someone following script. Rachel recognized the sound of fear masquerading as procedure. She recognized people choosing their own safety over someone else's dignity. Security arrived at noon. Not aggressively. Not with fanfare. Just 2 officers in blue uniforms carrying a cardboard box containing Rachel's personal items. Stethoscope. Pen light. The small frame photo of her daughter at 12, before the silence. Before the questions. Before the confusion about where Mom had gone. Her hospital badge was deactivated. A new badge would be issued to the next temp nurse by Monday. The replacement was already in motion. The escort down the corridor felt longer than it was. The ER staff watched. Some averted their eyes. Some nodded slightly, small gestures of silent solidarity that would cost them nothing and change nothing. Rachel walked with the posture of someone carrying weight that belonged to others. The rain hit the parking lot as she stepped outside, hammering the asphalt like applause for a performance nobody wanted to witness. She drove home in her scrubs. Still wearing the uniform of her latest identity. Still dressed for a job that no longer existed. The apartment was quiet. 3 p.m. Her daughter wouldn't be home from school for another hour. Rachel sat at the kitchen table in the chair she always used, the one that faced the door so she could see people entering before they could fully see her. Old habits. Old strategies. Useless now. The tears came when she realized she was staring at her hands. The same hands that had sutured wounds under fire. The same hands that had performed emergency pericardiocentesis on a general officer while the on-call resident stood frozen. The same hands that had just lost everything, twice over. Her military identity had been sealed away in silence. Her nursing identity had been terminated with a cardboard box and 2 security officers. There was nothing left that was visible. Nothing left that counted. The door opened at 3:36 p.m. Her daughter stood in the hallway, still wearing her school backpack, still carrying the weight of a 16-year-old's normal day. She stared at her mother sitting at the kitchen table in bloodstained scrubs, mascara running like accusations, the faded unit patch somehow visible inside Rachel's unzipped jacket, and asked in confusion, "Mom, why are you home early?" Rachel looked at her daughter and understood that she had failed at invisibility. The secret had not protected anyone. It had only delayed the inevitable breaking. 5 hours later, at 5:06 p.m., a trauma patient arrived at Sacred Heart's emergency department via ambulance. 47-year-old male. Gunshot wound to the abdomen. GSW to the shoulder. Multiple lacerations. Refugee from Tikrit, now seeking asylum. Now working as a translator for the Department of Defense. The paramedics wheeled him in shouting vitals, and the ER team mobilized with the precision of people doing this dance for the 100th time. Security was still removing Rachel's few remaining personal items from her locker when the commotion started in the ER. The translator's eyes snapped open. He saw the security badge. He saw the empty badge holder. He saw the woman in scrubs with the haunted eyes being escorted from the hospital by 2 officers, and something in his memory aligned with something in his present. He sat up against the advice of the paramedics and began shouting in broken English mixed with Arabic, his voice cutting through the organized chaos of the trauma bay. "That woman. That woman. She saved my life. In Tikrit. She is American hero. That woman saved my life. Do not let her go." Rachel stopped walking. The security officers stopped walking. The translator kept shouting, his body moving despite the pain, his voice carrying weight that nobody in the hospital understood yet. Rachel's daughter had driven to the hospital 30 minutes after finding her mother crying. She had demanded answers. She had stood in the administrative hallway refusing to leave until someone explained why her mother had lost her job. She had been waiting near the elevators when the commotion started. When the shouting erupted. When the translator's voice reached the administrative offices like a signal that something was wrong with the official narrative. She stepped forward into the corridor as Rachel turned toward the source of the shouting. She spoke with the clarity that only comes from finally understanding something that had confused her for months. "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres. United States Marine Corps. She is not a temporary nurse. She is a decorated combat medic." The silence that followed was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of institutional machinery grinding to a halt. It was the silence of people realizing that the story they had been told was not complete. The hospital administrator moved toward Rachel with his face changing in real time. Fear became recognition. Recognition became something like shame. He held her file, the official personnel file, but beneath it, in the secondary records that nobody checked because they assumed temporary meant nobody, were her military credentials. He opened the file with hands that trembled slightly, the pages rustling like leaves in a storm, and he began to read aloud, Navy Cross. Citation reads, "For extraordinary heroism in connection with combat operations against armed enemy forces in Tikrit." His voice grew steadier as he continued reading. The words he spoke were someone else's words, from a time and place that seemed impossible in the context of Portland, Oregon, a hospital that had just fired this woman for heroism. 3 Purple Hearts. Defense Superior Service Medal. Bronze Star with Valor. Dr. Hargrove had begun moving toward the exit. Slowly. Trying not to draw attention. The translator's voice had returned him to a moment he had not witnessed but had heard about in debrief rooms and command centers. A combat medic with hands steady as surgical lasers. A medic who had held lives together when everything was coming apart. A medic whose name had not been mentioned because the medic had asked not to be named. A voice cut through the gathering crowd. Deep. Calm. The voice of someone accustomed to giving orders that would not be questioned. A SEAL team leader who had flown in with the general was standing at the edge of the administrative hallway. His dress uniform carried insignia that made the hospital administrator stand straighter without realizing he was doing it. Senior Chief Torres, the SEAL leader said, led combat medical operations in Tikrit with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse Company. She treated 287 wounded Marines in a 9-month deployment. 287 lives because her hands didn't fail when everything else around her was failing. She received the Defense Superior Service Medal. She received the Bronze Star with Valor. And before she left the service, she received the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration. He paused, and his eyes moved to Dr. Hargrove. She has saved more lives than everyone in this hospital combined. The room went dead silent. The silence lasted exactly 6 seconds. Then the hospital administrator's voice cracked, "Dr. Hargrove, you will come with me." The SEAL leader looked at the security guard carrying the cardboard box. The same guard who had escorted Rachel out of the building. The same guard who had followed orders without knowing he was following orders into a historical moment. The SEAL leader nodded slightly toward Dr. Hargrove. The security guard walked to Dr. Hargrove's position. He held out an identical cardboard box. When Hargrove didn't reach for it, the guard set it down at his feet. "Dr. Hargrove, I believe you know the way out." Rachel stood motionless while the machinery of institutional consequence began its work. Within the hour, the board members that Hargrove had called would be calling back. Distancing themselves. Claiming misunderstanding. Throwing him from their networks as completely as a ship discarding ballast. The staffing agency would send an apology. The compliance investigator would withdraw his report. The attorney would sit alone in her office understanding that she had become complicit in something that had just become very public, very documented, and very career-defining. Rachel's daughter reached for her hand. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. The faded unit patch sewn inside Rachel's jacket lining, the only piece of her past she had kept, sat where it had always sat, no longer hidden but finally honored. The weight that had pressed down for 18 months, the weight of invisibility, the weight of silence, suddenly transferred to someone else's shoulders. Dr. Hargrove would carry it now. He would understand what it felt like to be seen as expendable. He would understand what it felt like to lose everything at noon, to be escorted out by people following orders, to arrive home at 3 p.m. and discover that everything you believed about your own authority had been fabricated. 6 months later, someone spotted Dr. Hargrove teaching CPR basics at a community college in the suburbs, his hands demonstrating compressions on a plastic dummy to bored students who had never heard his name. His medical license was gone. His hospital privileges were gone. His network had evaporated. The story had spread to 3 other hospitals in the Pacific Northwest. References went unreturned. Doors remained closed. He had become invisible in exactly the way Rachel had chosen to become invisible, except he had not chosen anything. It had been chosen for him. Meanwhile, Rachel Torres stood in her new office, Director of Emergency Medicine, the title placard gleaming under lights that seemed brighter than they had any right to be. She had been reinstated with full back pay. She had been promoted. She had implemented new protocols for recognizing combat medical experience in hiring. She had mentored 3 veteran nurses, helping them transition, helping them understand that their past was not something to hide in scrubs and silence. Her daughter visited during lunch sometimes, understanding finally what her mother had been doing all those months. Working nights. Accepting insults. Protecting something so quietly that it had seemed like cowardice until the moment it became revealed as courage. If you have someone in your life like Rachel, someone carrying something silently, someone working harder than anyone knows, someone choosing invisibility because the alternative is the weight of visibility, tell them you see them. Not after they save someone in crisis. Not after the truth explodes into public view. Tell them now. Because the truth is that heroes don't announce themselves. They don't demand recognition. They work in the moments nobody is watching, doing the thing that needs to be done, and then they go home and wonder if anyone will ever understand. Subscribe to this channel. Like this video. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? Because Rachel's story is not unique. It is just more visible than most.